Hi, good morning, the higher place. How are you today? Welcome to church. Well, as many of you know, we are in Nigeria and Ghana, one of the two countries at the moment. But really, I just want to welcome you to church today. Today, we've got something quite different to you. We're going to reach you today through the power of technology. Today is going to be a special message coming. And what we're going to talk about today is really something that people give different reactions to. Let me share this story with you. Some months ago, I got a text message from one of our partners in Nigeria. We run a charity in Nigeria and some parts of Africa, as some of you know. And I got this message, and the person told me that they wanted to talk to me on the message. So I thought, okay, maybe they'll give me a call or something. But in my head, I thought they were going to ask for money. So in my heart, I just locked up, like I don't want to talk to you because you're going to ask me for money, because I know that's what you're going to do. But after a few days, he got in touch. Even though I didn't initiate that process, he got in touch and then he spoke to me. He said he wanted me to pray for his cousin who was sick and at the point of death. And at that point I was just shattered, I was finished. And in my head, the first thing I thought about was that this guy was going to ask me for money. And at that point I just went on my knees and just asked God for mercy and all that. So I prayed with him, of course, prayed for the guy, got some people to pray along. But yeah, it was sad because the person eventually passed away. And that was very big in my heart. I was quite sad. And I think that is the place where many of us stand when we hear about money, or when we hear that the church wants to talk about money. The first thing that comes to our head is, I'm not going to respond to this guy just wants my money. But could it be that God is much more in the business of transforming our hearts when it comes to our attitude with money? So I said all that to say that the thing we're going to talk today is going to be all about money. And it's going to be in a critical area where many people don't like to talk about, which is tithing. And really, I've heard all kinds of messages on tithing, and for me personally, I tithe. I do over and beyond as much as I can do. And I think it's faithfulness for me to use my finances to build the kingdom of God. Of course, it's good to take care of my family, take care of myself, but I really want to be a person known for building the kingdom of God. So today I want to present a message to you. It's from a veteran, from a senior leader in the body of Christ, and he spoke expressly into this subject, and I believe that it's going to really bless you. So I just want to encourage you, remove distractions from this place, lean in, listen as much as possible, because God is going to set some of you free today. Open your heart. God bless you. Now we receive the message today. Put your hands together. Come on.
Malachi 3:8, will a man rob God? How could we do that? Because one can withhold tithe. Now, it's not every day I preach on the subject of tithing. I'll tell you what you may think is a funny story. Perhaps you know that we were called to be the minister of Westminster Chapel many years ago. I first went there as a guest preacher, well, let's say visiting minister, for 6 months. That was the plan. But I could tell after I was there a month or two, these people are hoping I'll stay. And I thought, we don't plan to stay here. But then the more I thought about it, what if we are called to stay here? And I thought, one thing is for sure, I'm going to preach everything I can think of in these 6 months that they may not like, so that they'll know what they're getting. And in those days, I was preaching through the book of Jonah. And I never will forget a book review of my book, Jonah, where the person who reviewed it said, where do you suppose Dr. Kendall gets tithing in the book of Jonah? And it was a fair criticism, because I found a way just to get it in, because I wanted everybody to know what I believed. You see, a lot of ministers are afraid to preach on tithing. They are afraid of what people will think, what their motives are. And, well, I didn't care what they thought about my motive. I wanted to know this is something I believe. I believe it with all my heart, practiced it. And so after I'd been at Westminster Chapel a year or two, my publisher had used several of my books already and asked me to write this and then that. I did something I'd never done before or since, because I don't open doors, I walk through them. But I phoned my publisher, Hodder and Stoughton, and said, I want to write a book on tithing. It was silence. Hello, you there? Yes, are you serious? I said, yes, I certainly am. Well, we'll come back to you. Well, a couple of weeks later, they said, look, if you want to write a book on tithing, would you buy 1,000 copies? Yes. Okay, we'll do it. They were convinced that it would be a financial disaster. They wanted to cover their losses. They did it just to please me. So I said yes. But in the meantime, I got Billy Graham, and then John Stott, and then Sir Fred Catherwood, and since then the Archbishop of Canterbury. You know, that book has been in print for all these years. In America, I think it's gone through 30 reprints. I don't know how many in England, and in many languages. And that's the background. Now, I was introduced to this subject when I was 10 years old, when my first job back in Ashland, Kentucky, was selling Grit, G-R-I-T. That's the name of a magazine. It came out once a week. And my dad said it was his first job when he was 10, and you had to be 10 years old to do it. And so we ordered a number of copies from Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and that day I went all over the neighborhood selling copies of Grit. When we got in, we got all our money together, and to figure out how much we had to send to Williamsport and how much I kept. As best as I can recall, the amount that I had kept, that I had made, was $1. At that point, my father put his finger on a dime, which is 10 cents, and said, "This, my son, is the Lord's." I said, "This is mine." "No, RT, this is the Lord's." I was annoyed. I said, "No, this is mine, and I want it. I earned it." "This, my son, is the Lord's." Dad won, God won, I won. I'll never forget it as long as I live. My father had this strange view. You could call it a mathematical incredulity, that if you give God his tenth, the 90% that you have left will go as far as the 100% you started out with. In fact, Dad used to say, I honestly believe it goes further. Well, we're talking now about the solution no one discusses anymore. They don't talk about it. It's so obvious what would help and change the church all over the world. The Church of England, for example, bad financial shape. And here's the answer right under the nose. I don't know what your finances are. I can't be sure why I'm here. God has a reason I'm preaching this to you. But I can tell you, if everybody would tithe, there would be more money to give to the world. This is God's plan. Well, when a fellow says, as we used to say back in the hills of Kentucky, you ever hear this? When a fellow says, it ain't the money, it's the principle, it's the money. After I came out with my book, Tithing, a person read it and wrote an article against it in the #1 Christian magazine of Britain. And here was his view. He says, we don't tithe. All our money is the Lord's. All of it. Well, that sounds so good. I ran into that man 8 months later. It turned out he became a friend. That's the funny thing. But I said, I want to ask you a question. According to you, all our money is God's. Tithing, he said, is just the beginning. I said, I want to ask you a question. Do you tithe? Or let me put it this way. The money you give to the church, does it come up to 10%? And he stared at the sky and looked down at the pavement, and he said, no, it doesn't even come close. And here was the man that wrote this article against me to get people they don't have to tithe. And he himself admitted, even though he says all the money's the Lord's, you see, the church never gets it. And this is God's plan. So Voltaire, the French atheist, said, when it comes to religion, all people's religion is the same. when it comes to money. John Wesley said the last part of a person to be converted is his wallet. A man by the name of Harlan Milby, old friend, paid my way through Oxford University when we came to this country. Paid every penny of our tuition. God provided in that wonderful way. And I never will forget fishing with him in the Florida Keys. And I said, Harlan, you've blessed people, and God has blessed you. He had actually founded 2 life insurance companies. And I said, how did it all start? How did you make your money? He said, oh, it's very simple. He said, soon after my wife Olive and I married, we were in deep debt and getting in debt. And I came across a verse, 1 Samuel 2:30. Them that honor me, I will honor. He said, from that day, we started tithing and never looked back. And the rest is history. Well, after Louise and I got married, we were in financial trouble. It's not her fault. Here's what happened. Before we married, I didn't know how to handle money. I bought stuff and thought that I'd have money to pay for it because I was working as a salesman, and should have waited a couple years before we got married. But in those days, I thought Jesus was coming any day, and I'd waited a long time, and it's what you're thinking. And so we got married. And I remember how I was so discouraged, not making sales. And we were not tithing, by the way. I had this philosophy at that time. The most religious thing I can do is to pay my bills. And God would want me to pay my bills first and then tithe. That was my reasoning. Well, okay, we didn't tithe. 2 years later, we were deeper in debt. I thought, when is this going to stop? The day came, I just said to Louise, I believe we should start tithing, and we did. I want you to know that was about 58 years ago. We never looked back. We didn't get out of debt in a day or a week. It took about 2 years. We got out of debt. I've not owed anybody a penny for almost 60 years. We will have been married 61 years next week. And, okay. I'm not a multimillionaire. My father was never a wealthy man. I don't have a Rolls Royce, and I'm not promising you a Mercedes, but I can tell you it's the best way to live. We're comfortable. God has given us all we need. And I'm not making any grandiose promises to you, but I can tell you this. It's the way God wants you to live. But in those days when we were first married, came in one day so discouraged. I noticed on the dining room table back in Springfield, Illinois, that's where we first lived when we got married, my grandmother had given us a big white Bible for our wedding present. And it was opened. And I didn't know what it was open to. And I was so discouraged. I thought, Lord, I want a word that is what I need right now. I want you to give me a word that will make me feel better. I choose to believe that what that Bible is open to, I'm going to walk over and see what's there. I did. It was open to Malachi chapter 3, verse 8. Will a man rob God? That's not what I wanted. I just closed the Bible, sat down, turned on the TV that we owed for, and I said, that's not what I wanted. Now, here's the thing, if you don't know what I'm talking about, because there's probably somebody here, you never heard of this before. What does it mean to tithe? The word tithe means 1/10. According to Leviticus chapter 27, verse 30, the tithe is the Lord's. In other words, it's His. He puts you on your honor to give it to Him. So if you earn £1, 10 pence belongs to Him. He puts you on your honor to give it to Him. If you make 10,000 pounds, 1,000 pounds belongs to the Lord. If you give him 500 pounds, then you've robbed him of 500. If you earn 100,000 pounds, then 10,000 is the Lord's. And if you give him 2,000, that means you've robbed him of 8,000. If you've given him 7,000, you've robbed him of 2,000. The tithe is the Lord's. He puts you on your honor to turn it back to him. Now, he's not like the Internal Revenue. He's not going to put a pistol to your head. The Inland Revenue, they just get it. They take it. God doesn't do that. He puts us on our honor. Now, I want to raise the question, why is it some Christians don't tithe? And I can tell you, reason number one, this may surprise you, they haven't been taught. This is what was my discovery. Nobody told them. Ministers afraid to preach it. They didn't want to have people wondering what their motives were. And I think I found one or two occasions where preachers didn't preach it because it meant they'd have to start tithing themselves. But the reason, mainly, they haven't been taught. I'll never forget, after we'd been at Westminster 25 years, and they kindly had a farewell service for us. Never forget this as long as I live. The number of people, as they filed by to shake hands, would say to me, "Thank you for teaching us to tithe." I wasn't prepared for that. And it's very simple. People haven't been taught. Never will forget when I was pastor of a church in Fort Lauderdale years ago. A man by the name of Bill Webb said, "Pastor, let me tell you how we started tithing." He had come from Detroit. And he said, our pastor in Detroit says, "Tithe for 6 months and then forget it." He said, we did, and we just have done it ever since. One of the members of that church in Fort Lauderdale, his name was Bob Walker. He let me know he didn't tithe. I said, fine. He said, "I don't believe in it. That's it." But then some months later, maybe a year or so, he said, "Guess what? Connie and I have started tithing." I said, "Good." And he said, "What do you suppose I'm going to say now?" I said, "You tell me." Here was his testimony. He said, "We haven't missed it." That to him was big. He thought if that 10% is going to cause him to get out of sorts financially, that he would need every penny. He said, "We just lived on 90% and we haven't missed it." Not the greatest testimony for tithing, but it's good enough. And the thing is, my dad was right. The 90% that you live on will go as far. And Dad thought it went further. Well, here's another reason some people don't tithe. I think it's more of an excuse, because if ever you can find the smallest loophole that you can wiggle out and not have to tithe, you're going to take it. But here's another one. Some people say tithing is what you did under the law. And Malachi 3:8, verses 8 to 10, that is under the law. And they're right. They're absolutely right. But what people don't realize is that the first tither was Abraham, who came along 400 years before the law came. You see, the law, the Mosaic law, was a parenthesis that lasted 1,300 years. Abraham lived in 1700 BC. 400 years later, 1300 BC, Moses came, the law, because of the transgressions of the people, and what Abraham had done willingly, now the people of Israel were told, you got to do it. It not only made it legal, but it was a requirement, you had to. And some will say, well, Malachi 3 was written under the period of the law. That's true. That's true. And what they forget, though, is that Abraham is the prototype Christian. You see, here's what happened. This man that was the Exhibit A for Paul teaching justification by faith alone. Read Romans 4. It's all about Abraham. Galatians 3:8, the gospel was preached to Abraham. And so the gospel goes back to Abraham 1700 BC. Well, he had a nephew by the name of Lot. And Lot foolishly pitched his tent toward Sodom. Well, what happened was that Abraham got caught in a crossfire between the king of Sodom and other kings, because Lot ended up losing all his possessions, his freedom. Word of that got back to Abraham, who went to rescue Lot with 300 of his trained men, 318. You read it in Genesis 14. You want to know. Genesis 14, there's the whole story. And the success of Abraham was phenomenal. He destroyed all of them. And then out of the blue comes a mysterious figure by the name of Melchizedek, king of Salem. And he came with bread and wine, which tells the Lord's Supper. And for some reason, Abraham gave Melchizedek the tithe of all the spoils. Nobody told him to do it, but he did it. And this was the practice of the patriarchs. Jacob was a tither. How did they know to tithe? I can tell you, it was imprinted on them by the Holy Spirit. This has been God's way of supporting the gospel for all these years. And so it began with Abraham. He did it voluntarily. And this is the thing. The law ended in 33 AD. And when Jesus died on the cross and uttered the words, "It is finished," it meant the law has been fulfilled. We're not under the law. We go back to Abraham. That means we do what he did voluntarily and out of gratitude. Do you realize that the doctrine of sanctification is the doctrine of gratitude? And tithing is a good work. But that is not done to get you to heaven. You need to know this. In case you didn't know, tithing will not get you to heaven. In fact, if you think it will get you to heaven, you're in bad shape. Not only will tithing not help you, it could hurt. You say, well, how could it hurt? It hurts if you think it helps, because that means you'll be trusting works and not what Jesus did for you on the cross. So tithing is something that Christians do because they're looking to Abraham, the prototype Christian. And Jesus said before Abraham was, I am. It all began with Abraham, and that's our model. Dr. O.S. Hawkins put it like this: the principal hindrance to the advancement of the kingdom of God is greed. It is the chief obstacle to heaven-sent revival. It seems that when the back of greed is broken, the human spirit soars into regions of unselfishness. I believe it is safe to say that there can be no continuous revival without hilarious giving. And I fear no contradiction that where there is hilarious giving, there will soon be revival. Here are 5 reasons we should tithe. Reason number 1, Jesus endorsed it. This is weighty, especially when you know when he did it and where. It's in the 23rd chapter of Matthew. There's an equivalent in Gospel of Luke as well. In Matthew 23, Jesus makes fun of the Pharisees. It's almost comical. You can see why the common people heard him gladly. And I'm sure if you had a video replay of Jesus and the common people hearing him and the way he made fun of the Pharisees, they were laughing their heads off. He said everything they do is for people to see. That's all the reason they do it. And then he went by the different things Pharisees did and preached and would destroy that. He would just knock it down one by one until he came to the subject of tithing. And the only time in Matthew 23 where Jesus gives just a little tiny bouquet to the Pharisees is in verse 23. This you should have done. He endorsed tithing. This shows that this is something that was to go on even after the law was fulfilled by the death of Jesus. Do you realize where missions would be today if Jesus had not said that? Major comment. Second, Paul assumed it. This is important. 1 Corinthians 16 verse 1. Paul says, on the first day of the week, lay in store and give it. And then he put it like this: everyone as God has prospered him. That's the tithing principle. In other words, it's in according to the way you've been blessed financially. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but tithing is the fairest system in the world. You and I have to pay a certain amount of money for petrol or a pound of minced beef at Sainsbury's, and what we pay is what the millionaire pays. It's what the multimillionaire pays. He only has to pay a certain amount for the petrol. We have to come up with the money. It's easy for him. But you see, tithing, it's in proportion to the way God has blessed you. And so Paul assumed it, that you would give in accordance with your income. But then there's a third reason: what it will do for the work of God on the earth. I've been saying it. Right under our nose is the plan that would work if the Christians would just do it. All he's asking of you is to give 10%. That's it. Here's the problem, though. You see, wealthy people, and I find this to be true. I hate saying it. I wish it weren't so. But a typical reason for a wealthy person, he doesn't tithe. He doesn't. He says, but the thousands I give is more than all the other people combined. He doesn't realize that makes God angry. You are not being blessed for the amount. You're being blessed by giving in faith. Something happened to me when I was at Fort Lauderdale, that same church that I referred to. One Monday, the treasurer came in and brought all the money, the checks, and poured it out on a table and said that I've got to go make an errand. I'll come back in an hour. Would you watch the money? Sure. Well, I stared at that table, and I saw all the checks written out. And I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I was curious. Sometimes I wish I hadn't. Sometimes I'm glad I did. But I was shocked. You know what I found out? The tithers at Lauderdale Manors Baptist Church were the single parents, the widows, the divorcees. These women who tithed. It wasn't a lot of money, but they tithed. You could tell that was their tithe. And those who made big money were not tithing. They said, well, we give more than the rest. You see, you're doing it for God. And He knows. The wealthy man giving thousands is no problem for him. The poor person giving just a few pounds, it takes discipline and a lot of faith. Well, what it will do for the work of God in the church, you'll have more money to spend for whatever, if only we could see it. There's another reason this ought to impress you. What it does for God in heaven. It honors Him. It glorifies Him. Hebrews 11 verse 6, without faith it is impossible to please Him. You see, when you tithe and you make the decision to live on 90%, that's faith. You're living by faith. Bob Walker said, we did it. We were afraid we weren't going to make it. He says, we didn't miss it. Faith. It honors God. And I don't know how you feel about what I'm getting ready to say. The question is, what gives you more satisfaction? When God pleases you or when you please Him? You see, we're living in the me generation, the me decade. Everybody asks, what's in it for me? What's in it for me? So much preaching, especially on Christian television. It's all about, what's in it for you? no one asks what's in it for God. And I want you to get to the place, if you're not there already, that you get satisfaction. Oh, you're honoring him. You please him. Get your satisfaction. And he'll please you in his own way, in his own time. But you say, Lord, I want to honor you. But reason number 5, you should tithe. And some would put this first, but I put it last. And that is what it does for us. Here's the way Paul put it, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6. He said, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And would you believe that the word cheerful comes from a Greek word that means hilarious? That's exactly what it means, hilarious giving. Well, that's what God likes. Well, these are the reasons you should. And by the way, what it does for you is not just at the material level, it will do something for you spiritually. I watch people when they start tithing, it does something for their spirituality. This Bob Walker that said, I don't tithe, and he started, and then he said, I don't miss it. He started to come in church on Sunday nights. For Southern Baptists, that was huge. The next thing you know, he's coming on a Wednesday night prayer meeting. And his spirit changed. He began to read his Bible and pray. Before I left, they made him a deacon. He starts out with this. And some of you have yet to discover what it would mean when you just honor God and what it will do for your spirit. And God will become more real to you than ever before. Well, practical question, to whom should you give your tithe? Answer. Malachi tells us, bring the whole tithe. That means all of it. You see, some people tithe once a week, and some once every 3 weeks. And that means you're passing up. There are those who say, well, if I go to church today, I'll have to pay the tithe. Look, if you don't go to church, send it in, or keep a record, so that at the end of the year you can show you are really giving the whole tithe. But where does he say to give it? The storehouse. Whatever is that. Ask any rabbi. It was the synagogue. It's like the local church. And so I'm saying, give it here, your tithe. If you want to give above your tithe, no harm done. You can give that to Billy Graham or the Gideons or missionaries. But everybody should give their tithe to their local church, and I don't care where it is in the world, it would change everything. The solution nobody talks about. Well, getting time, I must close. The man I was named after was Dr. R.T. Williams. He's my father's favorite preacher. I've gone by R.T. all my life. He tells a story of a man, a businessman, who made $1 million and gave $100,000 to the church and had receipts to show it, and sometime later went bankrupt. Well, the family and the friends and the cynics said, wish you hadn't given that $100,000 to the church. He said, are you kidding? He said, that's the only amount I kept. You see, the $100,000 was treasure in heaven. He said, if I hadn't given it to the church, I would have lost that too. Nobody would have got it. At least I gave $100,000 to the church. And here's the point. When I tithe, I pay a tithe to my local church. I'm not the pastor, but I do it. When I tithe, I see it as giving it to God, not to people. I wouldn't give it if I thought I was giving it to people. Well, maybe if it's top weight, it's all right. Seriously, why do I do it? The book I'm now writing should be out next year. It's called For an Audience of One. I'm doing it for him. You see, the Pharisees, they couldn't give unless everybody knew about it. The Pharisees, if they were going to give, they'd hire a band, one like here, play, get everybody's attention. Now notice, I'm giving this money. They couldn't bear giving it unless the world knew. No, you're giving it to God. And that gives one great satisfaction. W.A. Criswell, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas for many years, tells this story. There was a church in Texas, small church. Someone said, how many members in your church? He said, 300. 300. How many of them tithe? He said, 300. What? 300 members and 300 tithe? Oh, yes. He said about half of them give it to God, and he takes it from the rest. He has a way of letting your car break down. Or one lady wrote me a letter, said, well, hope you're happy. I'm tithing now, but the first week I get a bill from the Inland Revenue for 700 pounds. And she thought, well, that means God doesn't want me to tithe. You see, we're looking for any excuse. It's got to be a commitment, because it's between you and God. The King James Version has the most wonderful translation in Malachi 6. You know what it says? Prove me herewith. Are you aware that the Bible, which is God's in-house publication, never once tries to prove God's existence? You would think that since this is His Word, He'd want to get the Word out. Here's proof that I exist. Doesn't bother. No. In the beginning, God. That's the way it is. The nearest He ever comes to proving His existence is in this issue of tithing. He says, prove me. Prove me. Tithe and see if I won't pour out a blessing that's beyond what you're able to contain. That's pretty nice.